Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. The Pentagon is deploying thousands of U.S. troops to Eastern Europe as tensions rise between Russia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin is speaking publicly for the first time amid the crisis, blaming the U.S. and its allies for ignoring Russian demands. We'll have a live report in just a moment. And Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow on this Groundhog Day as millions of Americans braced for another winter storm. 34 states are on alert for ice, snow, and flooding stretching from the Rockies into the Northeast. Ice could cause traffic and power issues from Dallas to Memphis and Louisville. The storm is then set to move into the Northeast Thursday night into Friday morning with snow, sleet, and freezing rain expected from Washington, D.C. to Boston. And Arctic air could bring more than a foot of snow from central Illinois to New England. And here in New York City, thousands of police officers are paying their respects at the funeral of NYPD Officer Wilbert Mora. Mora and his partner were ambushed while responding to a domestic violence call. Officer Mora was hospitalized for 4 days before he died. His last heroic act, the 27-year-old organs were donated to save the lives of 5 others. President Biden will be here in New York Thursday to meet with Mayor Eric Adams after the mayor called for federal help on the heels of several recent shootings in the city. And the Pentagon has announced thousands of U.S. troops will deploy to Eastern Europe to deal with those tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Senior Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez joins me now. Now, Louis, let's start with the basics here. What message does this send to Vladimir Putin? Because we heard there from the Pentagon, they seem to want to send a message, we are with NATO and our NATO partners, our NATO allies, but also they are making this move without a NATO vote.
That's exactly right, Diane. NATO has not called up the NATO response force that would send an additional 40,000 troops into Eastern Europe, presumably should Russia invade Ukraine. What the United States has done today is they're sending 3,000 troops, 2,000 from the United States. That'll go primarily to Poland. Another 1,000 that are already stationed in Germany are going to move east into Romania. So what is 3,000 troops going to do against 100,000 Russian troops that are massed along the border with Ukraine? Not much, other than provide reassurance to those countries that the United States and NATO is working with them, and that there is this notion of collective defense that is written into Article 5 of the NATO Charter, that any attack against a NATO member is going to lead to self-defense by all of NATO's member nations. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So, and President Biden has been clear, and the Pentagon was clear today, that these troops are not going to Ukraine, but they're going to these nations that border Ukraine. And the message to those countries is, we have your back should something happen, particularly because you are a NATO member. But at the same time, this is messaging, as you said, that is intended for Russia, messaging to Putin specifically. You heard John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, announce during his briefing that we've not seen anything in terms of troop reductions from the Russians along the border, as they've claimed, but that Putin seems to only understand messaging like this, that there's actually going to be a tangible action here, that the United States is going to be sending 3,000 additional troops to these Eastern European countries that border Ukraine.
Now, Louis, Russia has been trying at least to point the finger at the U.S. with all this, saying that the U.S. is just using provocative rhetoric and exaggerating, essentially, the situation there and blaming the U.S. for provoking what's happening. So is there any worry that he could use this as sort of an excuse to say, see, the U.S. provoked an invasion, let's say?
You know, this is exactly a topic that came up with General Secretary Austin and General Milley last week during their briefing on Friday. The question was, do you think that any U.S. moves could be seen as a provocation by President Putin and Russia, or could they use this as an excuse that the tensions are being ramped up because the United States is moving additional forces? And the way that Austin answered it was that, no, this is all about Putin. It is not the United States that has massed 100,000 troops along the border with Ukraine. It is Russia. And they are the ones that need to answer for why they're doing that. What is their purpose? And if diplomacy is to have a chance, the United States has said that Russia needs to begin doing so by pulling back those troops so that we can actually have really engaged diplomatic action to address the concerns that they have, which, by the way, the United States has said pretty much is not going to happen. Russia has said that they want Ukraine not to join NATO, and the United States and fellow NATO allies have said that is a decision that only Ukraine can make. So the diplomacy continues, but in terms of messaging to Putin, this is what's going on with this deployment today, and we may see additional ones in coming days, as hinted at by Kirby today.
And I want to bring in Stephanie Ramos, our correspondent who's there in Ukraine. Stephanie, what's the latest from Kiev on all this?
Well, it's really interesting to speak to the folks that are here in the capital city, and we spoke to some people in a nearby village just a couple of hours away from here, and the general feeling that you get from the local residents is that this will pass, there won't be war, life is normal. However, there are some people who are preparing for a possible invasion. Just a few days ago, we spoke with a woman named Elena. She was attending a civil defense class, and she witnessed the 2014 Ukrainian revolution. She was here for that. She witnessed some of that violence, and she says that she doesn't think there will be an invasion here in Ukraine, in Kiev. However, she wants to be ready. She wants to be prepared. So she's taking these classes, self-defense classes, where they're going over things that you can use to defend yourself if you're at home and a war breaks out. So it's just really interesting to hear from the people here that they're used to being threatened by Russia, and they're preparing for the worst. However, they don't really think that will become a reality. And it's interesting to hear from the Pentagon spokesperson, John Kirby, who says that, yes, they're sending troops, but it's not, these deployments are not permanent, and it's more of a sign of reassurance and deterrence, and not so much wanting these troops to engage with Russian forces. And it's something that's welcomed by the people here. They want that reassurance. They want to know that they are supported. So I think not only will Ukraine welcome that, I'm sure they are welcoming that, but also the European nations and NATO allies as well.
So, Louis, what will the Pentagon be looking out for in terms of response from Vladimir Putin to all of this now?
And I think they're already anticipating that there's going to be a negative response to the U.S. buildup there in Eastern Europe, because that's kind of the reaction that they've already seen in previous deployments, that it's been the United States that's provoking by ratcheting up, by boosting their troop numbers in what's called the eastern flank of NATO. But ultimately, I think the United States is looking at the messaging that's going to come directly from President Putin in terms of how he's going to take this, because ultimately there's this diplomatic push that's being undertaken by the State Department. We know that Secretary of State Blinken, he worked with Secretary Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. They had discussions earlier this week, and actually they have agreed to meet yet again. So that diplomatic track remains open. And so that's really what this is all about. It's messaging to get to Russia to pull away its troops and to continue negotiating. But ultimately, this is something that is going to continue for quite some time, because even though Russia has claimed that they're pulling out troops, the United States has not really seen that. They're not seeing meaningful withdrawals, because instead what they're actually seeing is troop buildups in Belarus. That's a neighboring country that's north of Ukraine and much closer to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. They're seeing tens of thousands of Russian troops moving in there with really big capabilities, strengthening the capability that they would have to push into Ukraine, even if they wanted to push into the capital city of Kiev, which is something that last week Secretary Austin and General Milley both hinted at when they said that Russia has enough troops right now built up along that border that they could actually push and take over some of Ukraine's cities. That is a significant concern, something that obviously the United States wants to see not happening, and that's why they're sending this deterrence mission of sending these forces. Doesn't sound like much, but this is about deterrence, and we'll see if it actually has any impact.
All right, Louis Martinez, Stephanie Ramos, thank you both. And Pfizer has applied for emergency use authorization for its COVID vaccine for children under 5. The process now moves to an FDA advisory panel set to meet in a couple of weeks. Now, if the vaccine is authorized, the CDC would need to give the final green light, and we could see those first shots by the end of the month. So let's bring in senior national policy reporter Ann Flaherty for some more on this. And what are the different ways this can play out from this point?
Well, Diane, as you said, we could see the shots by the end of the month. That's certainly exciting news for all these parents out there, probably including yourself with little ones at home. I know so many families have been waiting for this because they feel like once their kids are vaccinated, they can move on, and it moves into a different phase of the pandemic. But what I really want to caution parents out there to know is that there's still a lot of data that we're missing on this. Pfizer last month had announced that they were disappointed in the results of these trials for kids ages 2 to 4. The good news is there's no safety concerns, but it wasn't as effective as they would like. And keeping in mind that it's only about 1/10 of the size of the dose that's being given to adults, then they wanted to see if a third shot might be necessary. So we are still missing that data. And I think that one of the things we might hear from advisors in a couple weeks is that they're going to question, do we move forward now when we don't have a full picture of this, or do we wait until we have a little bit more information, because this is not an age group that is at highest risk of complications from COVID.
Well, and to that point, a recent survey found only about 30% of parents with kids under 5 say they'll get this shot right away. And we saw a lot more debate over booster shots in the medical world than we saw over the first 2 adult doses of the vaccine. So do you think we're going to see a lot more debate over this vaccine for the under 5 group, given that trial data and that debate over whether or not these are even necessary for this young age group?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an age group that's going to be the slowest uptake that we've seen of any demographic, I think because they are at lower risk, or the lowest risk. And of course, when you talk to health experts and people in the hospitals, they say, you know, look, they can still get sick. If the vaccine is to be proven safe, you're going to be it's going to be much safer to go with that option than to go with the virus. So they're going to push this hard in public health circles. But I think a lot of parents might fall into the wait and see category. We saw this with the kids ages 5 through 11. Eventually, many parents did step up and vaccinate their children. It's not unreasonable to say, I don't want to be first in line. But as public health officials say, they need to give the information to parents so that they make that right decision, talk to their pediatricians, talk to their doctors.
And Ann, we're hearing a lot about this pandemic now becoming an endemic. So what does that mean from an administrative standpoint? What can we as a country do to be better prepared as we get more surges and new variants?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that people in public health circles are talking about right now is improving access to therapeutics, ramping up production to these antiviral pills like Paxlovid, testing, increasing testing, and also creating a system for testing. You know, you can sign up online and get 4 free tests delivered to your house, but many people are getting them and they don't know what to do with them. There needs to be more of a system in place so that people are testing regularly so we can catch that next wave. And I think most importantly, we have to vaccinate the world. The United States does not live as an island. So there will always be a threat of another variant. And until we really get that vaccine equity on a global scale, I think we're still going to be dealing with these waves of COVID cases.
All right. Ann Flaherty, thank you. And 2 officers were shot and killed during an active shooter situation at a college in Virginia while responding to a report of a suspicious person on campus. President Biden responded saying, quote, gun violence against law enforcement officers is sickening and must end. Our Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas has the latest. Hi, Pierre.
Diane, good morning. Tragedy came to Bridgewater College, a small liberal arts school of only 1,500 students, about 2 hours southwest of Washington, D.C. Just after 1 p.m. yesterday, campus police officers John Painter and J.J. Jefferson were responding to a report of a suspicious man near a building that houses classrooms and offices. After a brief encounter, the suspect pulled out a gun and shot the officers and then fled. The 2 officers, who were good friends and known as the dynamic duo, died at the scene despite the desperate effort to save them. The suspect, identified as Alexander Campbell, age 27, was arrested a short distance away. Police recovered multiple guns on and off campus. We have no motive, but you get the sense this terrible violence could have been much worse. Diane?
All right, Pierre Thomas, thank you. Coming up, former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores is speaking out after suing the NFL for alleged racial discrimination. The latest on his calls for major changes to the league right after this. Welcome back. Breaking news just in now. Jeff Zucker, president of CNN, has resigned following a consensual relationship with an employee. Zucker joined CNN in 2013. He now says he will be stepping down and will continue to follow this developing story. We're also hearing from former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores after learning he's suing the NFL and 3 teams for alleged racial discrimination. Flores was thought to be on the short list for some of the most high-profile jobs in football, but now he's accusing the league of being managed like a plantation. ABC's Trevor Ault has the latest.
Former Miami Dolphins coach Brian Flores speaking out for the first time after accusing the NFL of racial discrimination.
We need change. We need change. I know many very capable black coaches, some of my staff who I know, if given an opportunity or when given an opportunity, are going to go and do a great job on their interview.
In a proposed class action lawsuit filed Monday, Flores says the league remains rife with racism, particularly when it comes to the hiring and retention of black head coaches, coordinators, and general managers. In the last month, Flores was fired after back-to-back winning seasons in Miami and then passed over for the top job with the New York Giants. In his lawsuit, Flores says just last week the Giants invited him to interview for its head coaching vacancy, but Flores, who spent 10 years under Bill Belichick with the Patriots, says days before that meeting, his former boss mistakenly sent him these text messages saying the job had already gone to Brian Daboll, a white coach. He alleges that in 2019, when the Denver Broncos interviewed him, the team executives were disheveled, adding it was obvious they were drinking heavily the night before, accusations the team says are blatantly false. They, too, later hired a white coach. Flores is now calling both meetings sham interviews. He believes they were only granted to satisfy the league's 20-year-old Rooney Rule, which mandates teams interview at least one minority candidate for top positions. But the Giants say they are confident with the process that resulted in the hiring of Brian Daboll. The NFL responding to the allegations in a statement saying diversity is core to everything we do, and there are few issues on which our clubs and our internal leadership teams spend more time. We will defend against these claims, which are without merit.
There are still 5 head coaching vacancies, but as of right now, there is only 1 black head coach in the NFL. And Brian Flores says he knows he's risking his chances of ever coaching again by filing this lawsuit, but he said it had to be done to enact change, and he's hoping other people will join him in taking a stand. Diane?
Trevor Ault, thank you. And I want to bring in ABC News contributor and host of the Long Game podcast, LZ Granderson, for more on this. LZ, Flores says that he was interviewed for these jobs, but he calls them sham interviews, pointing to the Rooney Rule. Can you explain the Rooney Rule and Flores' argument here?
Sure, absolutely. Basically, the Rooney Rule has been in existence in the NFL for about 20 years. And the reason why it came to be was because there was an issue with the hiring practice in the NFL. Prior to the Rooney Rule, the first African-American or black head coach was hired in 1989. I was a senior in high school before the NFL even had 1 black coach. And so the Rooney Rule was put in place in order to try to correct that. Unfortunately, what has now happened is that owners and teams are now fulfilling the obligations of the Rooney Rule, which requires teams to interview at least 2 minority candidates for positions. But that doesn't guarantee that you're going to move on from the interview process to actually being hired. So when the Rooney Rule was put in place, there were 2 black head coaches in the NFL. Today it's down to 1.
Now, the NFL says diversity is core to everything we do. And yet, when you look at the number of black players versus the number of black coaches, a.k.a. 1, there's obviously a huge disparity there. So what more needs to be done? The Rooney Rule clearly isn't getting the job done. So what do you do from here?
I'm so sick of the NFL talking about how important diversity is to it when we have been having this conversation for 20 years. Like, how do they even rationalize saying that, knowing that they had to put a rule in just to interview us to begin with? How is diversity a core value? You just got your first openly gay player. How is diversity a core value? Dave Coupe came out in the 70s. You just got your first openly gay one this season. So diversity can't be a core value. Diversity is something that you say to get people off your back, that you're working on things. We'll put on a decal. We'll put in end racism in our end zone. Because at the end of the day, we're too popular of a sport to actually be held accountable. You know, the ratings for these past playoff games were double-digit jumps in terms of viewership. The NFL just signed a multi-billion-dollar broadcasting rights deal that was twice the amount of the previous deal. So the owners know all of this. They know they don't have to change. And so we're having these conversations about the hiring practices and what needs to happen. And they can talk about diversity being a core factor. But the reality is that we don't see that in terms of hiring and in leadership. You just got over the fact that you didn't want a black person to be a quarterback. That was recent. So what's really is a sham, Diane, is this notion that the NFL ownership group are sincere in these statements.
And LZ, quickly, because I want to ask you about Washington, too, but what do you make of the text from Bill Belichick and its role in all of this?
Well, I mean, Bill was congratulating a former assistant, and perhaps in the future he'll remember to type a last name because it doesn't appear Brian was good enough for him to keep them all separated. But it's a key piece of evidence because it shows that the interview that Brian Flores was headed to with the New York Giants was a sham interview because Bill Belichick already knew they were planning on hiring the white coach 3 days before Brian Flores even interviewed. So it's incredible evidence. And if I could just add one more thing, so far there have been 4 white head coaches hired. You add all 4 of those white head coaches together, they still don't have as many winning seasons as Brian Flores.
All right, LZ Granderson, always great to talk to you, LZ. Thank you. And coming up, our Byron Pitts sits down with one of the men wrongfully convicted of assassinating Malcolm X. His first interview since being exonerated when we come back. Welcome back. It is Black History Month, and with that, we have a preview of ABC News' primetime special, Soul of a Nation, Exonerated, the murder of Malcolm X and 55 years to justice. Byron Pitt sat down with Muhammad Azizs, one of the men wrongfully convicted of Malcolm X's assassination. This is his first interview since he was exonerated. Take a listen.
When Muhammad Azizs was exonerated in the killing of Malcolm X, his family was in court with him.
We are moving today to vacate the convictions of Muhammad Azizs and Khalil Islam for the assassination of Malcolm X.
Finally, it was time for the judge to speak, and all of our hearts stopped.
Based on the record that has been made today, the joint motion is hereby granted.
It was a wonderful feeling. Now the whole world knows that he did not do this.
Justice was 55 years in the making. Khalil Islam, convicted alongside Azizs, was also exonerated, but passed away in 2009 before he could clear his name. Both Muhammad Azizs and the estate of Khalil Islam have entered multi-million-dollar civil suits against the state of New York and have said they intend to sue the city, citing, among other things, all that was lost. 2 of Khalil Islam's sons never doubted their father, but they lived under constant threat.
My mother was in fear of our lives. That's why she had to move us to Hunts Point, which was a major culture shock.
I was 11 and he was 13, yeah. We feared people who had loyalty to Malcolm. We worried about government agencies. That's how paranoid we were.
Khalil Islam spent a lifetime trying to clear his name.
November 18th, 2021, your father is finally exonerated. What was that day like for you?
I thought that I would die and maybe my grandkids or my kids would live to see the day. I just couldn't believe it.
2 families, 2 men who endured decades of imprisonment. An example to all of a kind of resilience in the face of injustice no American should ever have to endure.
You don't strike me as a man who is broken at all. How was that possible?
God is on my side. I am the spirit of truth.
Our thanks to Byron Pitts for that, and you can watch Soul of a Nation, the murder of Malcolm X, tomorrow night at 9 Eastern on ABC. I'm Diane Macedo. Thank you for joining us. ABC News Live continues with news, context, and analysis. Stay with us.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.